Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose bookstore. My name is Ramsey. I'm a bookseller at Politics and Prose where we host in-person events along with partnered support events, trips, and classes. For a complete list of everything confirmed, please go to our website, politicsandprose.com. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. When it comes to time to open the floor to your questions, we have a mic stand in the front to the right of you. Please come to the mics, speak into it for the author and audience to hear your questions, as well as for our audio recording. Following the Q&A, we'll have a signing up here at this table, so if you've not already purchased the book, we have many copies behind the registers at the front of the store. We'll ask you to line up, and we'll come by to ask you for personalization, so please have your book ready for us. Once the event is complete, please fold up your chairs and leave them against something sturdy. So now, tonight, I'm very excited to welcome author Aatish Taseer, celebrating the release of The Return to Self, Excursions in Exile. Aatish is an author of the memoir Stranger to History, a son's journey through Islamic lands, and the acclaimed novels The Way Things Were. A finalist for the 2016 Jan Michalski Prize, the Temple Goers shortlisted for the Costa First Novel Award, and Noon, and the memoir and the travelogue The Twice Born. He's also the translator of the volume of Sadat Hassan Manto's short stories of stories from Urdu, Manto Selected Stories. His book has been translated into more than a dozen languages. He's a writer at the large for T, the New York Times style magazine. Born in England and raised in New Delhi, educated in the US, and previously a journalist in the UK. He now lives in New York. Aatish will be in conversation with Ashen Tharoor. Ashen is a columnist on the foreign desk of the Washington Post, where he authors the World's View newsletter and the column. In 2021, he won the Author Rose Media Award and Commentary Prize administered by the American Academy of Diplomacy. He previously was a senior editor and correspondent at Time magazine, based first in Hong Kong and later in New York. So now please welcome Aatish and Ashen.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Yes. Great to see you all on a steamy DC night, and great to welcome Aatish to DC. Aatish is a writer I've admired for many, many years, both his fiction and his nonfiction, and it's a real privilege to be tapped to be the DC representative of his book tour promoting a return to self. I think there's so much to discuss. I would love to just jump right into it. This is a tremendous book of self-reflection, a book of exploration, a book of travel, a book that meanders through history and politics, and really existential questions of belonging and identity as well. And I suppose the spur for it, the prompt for the book, and what you open with, right, is what befell you more than half a decade ago. And I suppose, without having to say too much myself, could you talk about your relationship to India? We should say Aatish is somebody who has a very unique background, but the initial spur of the book is when the Indian government decided to revoke his OCI. And OCI, for those who don't know, is an overseas citizenship of India. It is equivalent to permanent residency, but because India does not allow dual citizenship, many Indians who choose to naturalize elsewhere or take citizenship elsewhere then end up with OCIs. But of course, the government has the right to scrap it when they so choose, although that's not something we've seen before. And a certain event happened that led to Aatish losing his, and then gave us this book. So could you take us from there?
I mean, it's so funny if I actually walk you through that year. I feel like I'm exposing you to almost quite a loose side of my life, whereas one goes on a holiday. Well, imagine May. It's the year of the month of the general election. I write the cover of Time magazine.
So this is 2019.
2019, and we are sort of like, I began my career at Time magazine. So I knew Time magazine in the days when the cover of Time magazine would come out and it would sort of make make news, and it was sort of an event. And I'd seen the sort of fortunes of Time magazine change, and I wrote this essay, which was a very considered, very gentle essay. It was like many other essays being written at the time. And they ran it on the cover of Time under the title of India's Divider in Chief, and had this kind of volcanic reaction in India, and Modi's troll army and his sort of like, there was kind of wave, like Time magazine didn't know what had hit them, and for sort of, then finally the Prime Minister spoke, and he said, he's Pakistani, which is the most coded, most powerful. And in my case, he was not entirely wrong, but I was also the kind of Pakistani who'd really never been to Pakistan or knew my father or had grown up entirely in India. And I thought, if you're in this business, you should be thick-skinned. And I took it kind of on the chin as much as one can. And by August, I had a letter from the Home Ministry, and we were like, little holiday in Greece, and suddenly my mother sends me this message saying, well, you commit the crime of hubris, and there's a sort of equal opposite reaction, and like, well, now they've kind of come for you. And for months, we just sat on it, sort of trying to appeal it, trying to think that there would be a way out. And then one of the Indian news portals got hold of it and broke the story. And the secretary of the Home Minister jumps on Twitter and cancels the document on Twitter before I've received like a formal communication. So you can just, the element of that brutality or that malice, it's very important to understand, because it's part of the character of what is being done to you. It's not simply, sorry, the computer says no. It's like, we are taking this away from you in a certain way, in a public way, in a way that like indicates kind of a certain brutality. And of course, like it's not simply that, okay, well, you don't have this, but you can come by some other means. You're then completely prevented from returning to your country, from returning. And, my grandmother who raised me died in the meantime. My mother's 75, my stepfather. So it's come very close suddenly. You're brave in the first year, you're brave in the second year. And then after a while, they are so clever because by introducing this fundamental insecurity into your life, and I think we know a version of this now here, and we know that how somebody like Khalil would have felt, where you just it's that, I mean, uncertainty is the sort of thing that can just eat away at your life, and for a writer who needs to be able to write with that security that something terrible is not going to happen to him and the people he loves. I mean, they were very effective. They entered my head,
You're born in Britain to a Pakistani and Indian set of parents, raised in India by your Indian mother. You are now based in the United States, where you found your life and your love and your partner. Before this happened to you, did you feel you had a kind of global cosmopolitan identity, and did you feel secure in it? And was this a moment where precariousness was introduced for you?
Thank you for. I'm so happy you used that word, because one of the ambitions of this book is to reclaim that word. We use it. It's such a dirty word, cosmopolitan, but it's we think of certain societies in which cosmopolitanism has been forced on people. It's been a symptom of displacement. It's been a symptom of exile. It's not cosmopolitanism is not simply, I'm on the plane from Dubai to London. It's also Jews, it's Armenians, it's Parsis, it's all kinds of people. And this is not, it's a weirdly, it feels like a modern phenomenon, but that experience of being at home in more than one or two cultures and carrying different societies in your head, it's a very old experience. And it's always provoked suspicion. It's always become the sort of target of a kind of anger. And the cosmopolitan is the man of the city, the merchant, the man
elite.
Yeah, but also like, you know, somebody who, you know, I think Spain is a wonderful example. There's a chapter in Spain in this, and you know, it came to the point where every concession was asked of these people to kind of know what was in their heart, of the Jews and the Muslims of Spain, to sort of really interrogate them. And they gave as much ground as they could. And every time they gave more ground, they became even more suspicious to basically that spirit of Inquisition, for the limpieza de sangre, the pure blood. And when they were driven out, it was because they when that quest for purity, when that quest starts up to root out the cosmopolitan, it's a nihilistic quest. You cannot actually satisfy what the other person wants. And I think that's a very important thing for cosmopolitans to learn, because, you know, you want to give ground.
Right, and what is the authentic identity and what is not the authentic identity, right? And I think a lot of the book, and we'll get into some of this, a lot of the book shows the depth of, I think, hybrid, syncretic experiences and cultures in all places in the world. And I guess maybe this is an entry point into sort of what launched you forward. So you lose your bureaucratic connection to India, you lose your rights to be in India, your rights to, you know, to go to India. But you write earlier on in the book that loss came with this kind of unexpected sense of relief. Could you talk a bit about that?
So I think that I had spent so much time cutting away parts of myself in order to better belong. And I think we do that often. You know, literally, the kid who's known one other country in school comes in and he's teased for it, and he renounces that connection, or he like tries to make himself a little smaller to better belong. And in India, it was funny because the root of my cosmopolitanism, which was Indian history, which was the connection to the Islamic world, which was the connection to Southeast Asia, which was the connection to the West, India was the crucible of a kind of cosmopolitanism. And so it was a great privilege to be able to travel with sympathy in places, in societies other than myself. It was part of what made me a good traveler. But in India, that was something contemptible, because India, in this new iteration, cared about itself in a very self-involved way, and it cared about the West as a source of power and prestige, and it didn't care about Syria, or it didn't care about Iran, or it didn't care even about Southeast Asia. So there was this need. As a young man, my first book was a book called Stranger to History, where you don't know it at the time, but when you're 25 and you sort of travel from sort of Venice to Dubai by land and then on to South Asia, you think it's just something that anybody can do. And then you arrive in Syria and you rent an apartment and you start to talk to people and you make a narrative and you start to get going as a writer. And it was something I was very proud of in retrospect. And when this thing happened, where having tried so hard to belong to a place, they said, nothing is enough, carry on. I thought, well, you know, I'm free. I can let those kind of natural curiosities, that natural sort of the life of the mind, all of the things that one has cherished and built up inside, you can let that kind of come in again. And it was timed, or it coincided with this moment where I had this absolutely wonderful editor at the Times, who's a great novelist herself, Hanya Yanagihara, and she, in these very, very big, very considered pieces, would send me to different societies to kind of write about them. And I was my 25-year-old self again. Do you know? And there is a moment where, so I have a father who I was estranged from, and I compare that need to be his son a little bit to that need to be authentic in India. And suddenly, when he was gone, I remember the writer V.S. Naipaul saying, because I was probably speaking of him, he died a very heroic way. He was defending a Christian woman who'd been accused of blasphemy. He was the governor of Punjab. He was assassinated by his own bodyguard. But I had a very difficult relationship with him. He was a hard person for me, very patriarchal. And I remember telling Naipaul when he died, I said, I was speaking of him in a kind of rehearsed way, and Naipaul stops me short and he says, but your father was your great enemy, so you must also be relieved that he's dead. And I thought, like, it was the kind of absolution only a writer could offer. It was such a provocative, difficult thing to say, and yet in my heart of hearts, I knew it was true. And that was very similar to what that Indian expulsion or banishment or whatever felt like.
So let's talk about where it took you, this kind of relief, the new sense of self, and the return to self took you. I think you wanted to read a passage from Mongolia.
Yes.
And I think this might be a good point to do it.
I chose this passage perversely because I thought, here's a political town, and I thought, I'm going to give them everything except politics. So we're in the middle of a pilgrimage, 3 great faiths, 3 great pilgrimages, Buddhism and shamanism in Mongolia, Shia Islam, Ashura in Najaf, and Bolivian Christianity, Andean Christianity of the Altiplano, which is very syncretic, old religion coming up, meeting Catholicism. And this is a moment in Mongolia. I hardly saw Ulaanbaatar until the end of my time in Mongolia. The location of the capital, once known to the Mongols as Khuri, meaning monastery, and later to the Russians as Urga, had not been fixed until the late 1700s, and even today the city of nearly 1.7 million has the air of a giant encampment, a suburban sprawl of ger neighborhoods, ramshackle houses and yurts, surrounded a Soviet-style city center of decaying apartment blocks and bureaucratic behemoths touched up with blue glass and steel. On my penultimate night in Ulaanbaatar, I went to meet a woman named Gerlema, who went by Gima for short, for a shamanic ceremony. She lived in a Ger neighborhood in a small house with a yard full of rubble and rotting armchairs. A white Hyundai sat on cinder blocks framed against the setting sun. Gima, a stout chain smoker in her 60s with a single upper tooth, had been an East German trained electrical engineer under communism before becoming a shaman in 1991. She'd often travel up to 5,000 miles a year on pilgrimages to Uvs province in the west of the country to draw energy from the places where one of her ancestors, a powerful shaman in his day, had once lived. As we sat in an upstairs room full of taxidermic birds of prey, she told me that she mostly uses her shamanic power to help people cure illness and dispel dark energy. Gima donned her heavy reindeer skin coat, hung with a bear's foot, a vulture's claw, a wolf's paw, and brightly colored tassels. She made offerings of milk and vodka, which her spirit, like those of most in Mongolia, seemed to relish. With a veil over her face and feathers on her head, she began to beat a pentagonal drum, dancing about the small room. Once the spirit took hold, Gima slumped down on the floor and began to speak in the gravelly voice of her male ancestor. She told me not to be scared, but it was scary. The spirit asked about my life, and I gave him the salient details. I was the love child of a Pakistani politician and an Indian journalist. My father had been assassinated by his own bodyguard. I was married to a man from Tennessee and had been unable to return to India to see my family since 2019, when Modi's government had stripped me of my overseas citizenship, only months after I wrote an article critical of his re-election. The spirit saw darkness in my life. He asked me to envision my home in the United States, and touching me, flew there to dispel that dark energy. My mind zoomed up too, giving me an aerial view of the scene of a shamanic ceremony in a little house with the sun setting over the hills surrounding Ulaanbaatar. I thought of my fellow pilgrims, Eduardo Quintela and his quiet tribute to his father, Araceli Alson, full of gratitude for Santiago's restored mobility, and the woman at Erden Zoo on her perilous journey. Pilgrimage in that moment seemed to me less like an exteriorized mysticism and more a rite of remembrance. The world would have us forget what is painful. It would have us move on and be free of the past. But both as individuals and societies, we have our loyalties to what we have known and endured. Pilgrimage gave us the illusion of a forward movement across space, even as it allowed an inner journey toward communion with our past. It was a crystallization of the poet Joseph Brodsky's idea that if there is any substitute for love, it's memory.
That's a beautiful passage with a lot there. I have to ask the very blunt, oafish question: did you really have a experience with the Central Asian spirit?
She had the experience. I was merely a bystander.
As Aatish kind of outlined, this comes in a sequence where he's going from Bolivia to Mongolia to Najaf, the holy Shia shrines there in Iraq. You're really on this kind of incredibly, and you're somebody who's not necessarily of any particular faith. I mean, you have your background, but you're not somebody a religious person.
Yeah.
How did your sense of self, your sense of the world that made you, the India that made you, for example, shadow this pilgrimage?
It's a funny thing that you've asked that. So the other night I was at dinner and a woman said to me, a scientist and a cancer, she's devoted to Urdu poetry and to curing cancer. She's an extraordinary woman. And she said to me, that a friend had said, good people do good things, bad people do bad things, but for good people to do bad things, what is needed is religion. And and it's a curious thing. I've always been at an oblique angle to religion. I've experienced it in my life. My first book was a book of feeling like a fraud in Mecca, of coming without faith to Mecca, of not knowing how to enter this thing that and faith, you have to, it's like a means of knowing. If you're there without faith, the whole thing is like an empty show. It's like going to a museum and not knowing the first thing about art. Well, you can't expect the art to do the work for you. You have to do the work. And faith is like that. You have to come with something in your heart and see if it's rewarded or whatever. And so finding myself 20 years back writing about pilgrimage, I fell into all the same traps. And I thought, here I am among these scenes of rapture, these scenes of devotion, scenes that actually religiosity makes me uncomfortable. My father was killed by a fanatic. I've seen fanaticism in India. So there was this moment where I was sitting with a young man who was a Bolivian musician who was reviving the Baroque music of the 1700s in Bolivia. And we were starting to talk about this pilgrimage to Copacabana on the edge of Lake Titicaca. And at one point he said to me, my father used to take me on that pilgrimage. And he said, my father died during COVID. And he said, one of the really peculiar things with pilgrimage is you think you go with people and you're going to talk to them, but actually it makes you very silent. It's very stilling. And you have this kind of inward journey, even as you're making this external, lateral journey. And he said, I'm going very quietly to play at the high mass at the shrine of Copacabana, and I'm going to play this Baroque music, and it's a tribute to the memory of my father. And at that moment, it kind of like, you think, idiot. Like, it's that human side that makes religion so powerful. And for me as a writer, if I can enter that, if I can be part of that side of things, then I'm doing my work. Even if in the moments when the ecstasy takes over, you feel a sense of outsideness or absurdity.
So that's really wonderful. And I think it'd be helpful now. You know, the book traverses an incredible disparate geography. You're in Istanbul, you're in Central Asia, you're in Bolivia, you're elsewhere. What to you is the thread that links your travels?
So I think in a funny way, like there is a kind of connective tissue that one tries to put almost like there's a connective tissue that's real, that's in the heart of the book, and there's something that a kind of scaffolding that a writer sometimes try to impose on different pieces like this. In this case, the connective tissue for me, the writer Octavio Paz would use this phrase. He would describe what he called historical controversy. And for him, that meant the wounds of the past, societies with layered history, with syncretism, with... and I'm not talking about the history of ornaments and of textbooks and of like, placards. I'm talking about the kind of history that roils, that kind of that sort of turns in your gut. In this country, obviously, the interracial drama is an example of that kind of history. But a country like India will have 2 or 3 such episodes, and they will come back again and again and again. And the heart of this book, the connective tissue, is that stuff. It's in Mexico. If I'm in sympathy with people in Mexico mourning a pre-Columbian past that is actually physically intangible and that they yet desperately want to commune with, it's because I've known that sense of loss in a place like India, and so these I think of it almost as a work of historical reportage, where you're kind of reporting back from certain fault lines in history in different societies, and that tension is probably, I think, in a totally unfalse, real way, the connective tissue.
So you're going to these places where, as you said, there are layers of complicated cultural histories. In some cases, various stages and generations of political traumas as well, and identities and kind of societies that are arranged or sort of constituted by this very layered and textured historical experience. And then certainly, as we're both, denaturalized Indians, we come from a country that is nothing without this textured sense of itself, although I think you're writing in a moment where you have political dispensations in various parts of the world that don't like that texture,
Right.
that don't like, that don't want to celebrate the richness or the complexity of what they are.
Yeah.
How much does that feature in sort of what you're doing and engaging with?
So I'm fascinated by this moment right now in this country. I was doing a trip where I was trying to repurpose the old Route 66, and it was a kind of reckoning with the fact that I one day might die in America. And one of the things that had struck me very much was it struck people for a solid 200 years, this idea of what Wyndham Lewis calls the rootless Elysium, like no American worth his salt ought to go searching for roots, because the greatest advantage that he has is that he's free of the ties of tribe and caste, which is another way to say sublimated history, and his that power, that impatience with history. You feel it in America. There's this lovely moment in Train of Powder by Rebecca West where she talks about an episode with an American newspaper man and an African American boy, and it turns ugly. And there's some European visitors, and they say, you Americans, you have your history, you have your problems just like the rest of us. And the man looks at him and he says he was brutal in his contempt, and he says, no, you have all the things all these problems over there in Europe. For us, it is just to get rich. We will be a country without history. And that conceit has obviously, in very, very real ways, been broken to pieces. And it's a very interesting breaking down, because on one hand, you have somebody like Vance talking about how, no, this is not an abstraction. It's not an idea. It's an ethnic reality, And then you have people who come with hope in their hearts, feeling that still the American frame of belonging is so elastic that it will allow them to be practicing Sikhs, practicing Hindus, and be part of, be able to support the Oklahoma Sooners or whatever. Like they can have these hyphenated identities. And one of the moments in the trip that like really went very hard for me was I was coming as an Indian from the real India, and I arrive in this moment in St. Louis, and there's a statue to Bentham, one of the great like senators, and he's in a toga, and it says, "There is the East, there is India," and he's kind of bringing forward the dream of Columbus as westward expansion. And as I started to go west, I started to encounter, like, have proper, real conversations with people, with Native Americans, who obviously also cannot think of this country as an idea and must only think of it as home. And so this like, it's very, very, it's a very complicated, like, kind of thing, a sort of like a kind of new equilibrium is being struck between the conceit of the idea and real and just that very deep sense of belonging coming up in the bones, and one watches with trepidation.
And this is something you've been wrestling with for years in your writing and in your thinking. I remember meeting you maybe a bit more, like almost a decade and a half ago, maybe a decade plus, in a particular drawing room in Delhi.
Your father's drawing room.
Yes, my dad's drawing room in Delhi. And you talking quite presciently about the coming majoritarian tide in India, based on some of your own kind of reporting. And I think this was you were describing a conversation you had with a boatman in Benares on the waters of the Ganges, and talking about how a certain kind of post-colonial milieu that existed, that defined India, in my mind, in very positive, universal, beautiful ways, was on the verge of being swept out. And India, that was an idea.
Yeah.
As you're saying, do you feel the kind of resonances of all that happening in different places all at once? Yeah.
I mean, we have to, like, there's just too much evidence for us to still pretend that this is the problem of a single society, or that it's even a political problem. We are obviously in the grip of a huge cultural transformation, and if we don't look at it on the cultural level, we'll be on the back foot. And I think it's very important to understand, while like asserting one's sort of whatever beliefs, values, all of those things, you don't have to be in sympathy with another position, you don't have to yield your own. But if you don't see it as cultural, I think that you're not really reaching the inner vibration of the kind of the sort of the tumult that we're experiencing and God, thank you for saying that I was prescient in India. Not in a million years could I imagine that I would be sitting in the United States and people could be able to understand a shade of that same experience here. I mean, it was inconceivable to me. The West at that point seemed settled and pacified and like complete, and there would never be that kind of like an upsurge of such brutality in these societies. In fact, I thought like they kind of half missed, those great convulsions that like Asia, Africa, South America was beset with. But I mean, here we are, and the moment is here.
I think that's a good point to ask you. You naturalized as an American not long ago. What did that feel like? What did that feel like for you? What did that mean to you?
I was very proud. I find it still. Even that trip of I'm married to a man from Tennessee, and I'll tell you a silly story. When I was in Benares, the kids in Banaras and Varanasi. It's the sort of epicenter of it's kind of Indian Jerusalem, Mecca, whatever. Like, and the kids would come up to me and they would always say, they would tell me the cliche of every person. Oh, the Japanese have cameras. The Italians are so beautiful. And then they would come and say to me, American jhoot nahi bolte hain, which means like the Americans don't lie. And I was like, what are you talking about? What do you, what an absurd thing for somebody to just come up. And do you know, as I've sort of like become part of...
It's why it's so easy to scam them, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, when I remember when I came out to my Tennessean, or when my husband came out, I remember him like telling his mother, and his mother behaved appallingly, as in mine, but for different reasons. Mine was an old fag hag, whereas his mother was a religious woman and was afraid of his soul. Anyway, she once she made her peace with it, she was absolutely determined that she'd tell her mother, who was a 97 evangelical Christian woman. And when I saw that, I thought, wow, like the kind of reality that I've lived with in India all my life, of these many planes, where there's certain things you tell people who work for you, there's certain things you tell your family, and you live with these pockets of life. And that balance is everything. And this idea of a unified moral plane, to me, was utterly radical. I thought, like, leave the poor woman who's evangelical. She's, let her die without knowing that her grandson's gay. I mean, she was born before D-Day. Give her a break. But that like, I find that like, I don't think that anecdotal as it is, and it's not like held up as sort of like, but there are certain aspects about living here that are extremely moving, despite the fact that they're under assault. And that, I think, on one hand, the welcome, which is what people feel a lot. The other is the absence of malice. People like happy to see you doing well, which is not an Indian experience. And and lastly, I think that it's very interesting to see this idea fight its way out. And if the idea prevails again, it'll be stronger. And I think, because, sorry, I'm going on a little bit, but this is just a very interesting point, because one of the things that also goes on in this book is this idea of gays. For a long time, we felt in the East, in the old non-West, encircled by the gaze of outsiders. And I think for the first time, traffic is moving the other way. And people, like, so there's the inscription or the sort of... I use a line from V.S. Naipaul in the beginning of the book, where he says, to awaken to history was to cease to live instinctively. It was to see yourself as other people saw you, and it was to know a kind of rage. And he was writing about India in the 1980s. And I think that experience is something that is being felt here today. And you feel it in the anger that it generates. And so there is, yeah, very, very, very obviously, I'm not a betting man, but it's not uninteresting.
And the actual ceremony itself, to me, when I went through it, it was one of the most beautiful experiences. Is this rite of civic patriotism that isn't necessarily something you experience in many other societies. I mean, I think every American, natural born or naturalized, should experience it in some way. I meant to say earlier, please line up for questions. We have time. I'll be opening up the floor very soon for questions. There's a microphone right here. When you ask your question, please identify yourself, and of course, try to restrict it to yourself to a question and not a comment. While we wait for questions, one thing that is really something that's fun to read in the book is there's a lot of wonderful descriptions of food.
Yeah.
Could you talk about the role food played in some of your reporting and writing here, and how it kind of powered some of the narrative?
Well, in a funny way, so food was also like so interesting as a metaphor, because is there anything that inspires more nativism than food? And then you do this trip and you realize, that the innovation of tomatoes into the Mediterranean, or of potatoes into Ireland and Russia, of peanuts into Southeast Asia, or even chilies in India, all of it, these things have been absorbed so easily, and people like have so quickly made them their own, and yet like they'll have like a historical wound from 200 years that they're still not able to put to rest, but they've like gobbled up their potatoes, you know. And so that like it was about like I think about the kind of perversity of the sort of that physics of belonging, of rootedness, of what you make your own, and the illusion also of what you think is yours and what has come from outside.
Sir.
Hi, my name is Owais. I'm your father's friend, and we've been in school together. He was a year senior to me, so I know him. I've also met your mother at Nusi's house. So I have just a very simple question to ask you, and I said that if your father was like Obama's father from Kenya, would that reaction have been as volcanic as it was?
1 minute, I just want to make sure I understand correct. You mean?
I mean, if he was not from Pakistan.
No. I mean, they were transparent about it. They said, people in the ministry said they're like, but why did you not keep your name like this? I was like, people don't name themselves. I was like, I don't know. My mother must have wanted to give me a sense of, you know, of who I was. But it was very much, they were like, if it had been Aatish Singh, then you would have been okay.
Yeah, that's
so.
It
It was very much. It would have been bad already if it was a Muslim name, but it was doubly bad because it was the Muslim name of a Pakistani. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. My name is Javed Amir.
Sir, could you speak closer to the mic, please?
My name is Javed Amir. I do write novels and short stories and things like that. I was, by the way, with your father in St. Anthony's High School and later in Government College. So, you know, your older generation is speaking to you in hindsight. I've read part of your book. It's fascinating. It's beautiful writing and intellectually stirring. You know, mixed emotions you get while reading the book. And it's very erudite, of course. Lots of questions come to my mind. Basically, the one about Spain that you mentioned.
Yeah.
That, you know, they had this tremendous cosmopolitanism, you might call, or syncretism, or whatever the word, that it was multiple. Realities were not one reality. And then comes, you know, the Jews and the Muslims lived in Toledo and Cordoba and all those places for centuries. And suddenly there was a reversal. And Isabella and Ferdinand, the reconquest, you know better. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that the moments like that, when they happen, and there's a break with the liberal order, will it be permanent? Do you think it's irreversible? Or what is happening even in this country, that it won't go back to what it used to be?
No, very much irreversible. I think that the convivencia, which is what that period of the living together, and fanaticism rose. It's like imagine like the most perfect arc. So you have generosity from the Muslims, and then fanaticism from the Muslims. Then you have generosity from the Christians and fanaticism from the Christians. And so you have this, it's a perfect, like, almost like a mandala of like human nature, of the way that human beings cannot be trusted to sort of keep these things that have, and with Spain, it was so interesting because the wounds themselves was so grievous. It destroyed, you know, because they were on the precipice of this great expansion. They, you know, these two great nations, England and Spain, that mothered like the New World, and the Spanish enterprise, because they had done something so heinous and it had harmed them. They carried that fanaticism over to the New World, and it undermined their project in the New World. And so this is like one of those really, really wonderful historical moments where you know, when Baldwin talks about how the pain inflicted by the perpetrator is just as much as to the victim, like this is the ultimate historical allegory for that.
This is rather a personal question, so please don't answer it if you don't want to. You said when Naipaul told you that your father was your enemy, you felt that he was your enemy, and you felt the same way about India. You went to Mecca and you didn't feel a connection because you have no faith. But it seems to me that when you spoke about these three experiences, there was some kind of connection that you had with all three. I'm sorry, I'm bringing them together.
Yeah.
So could you please tell us, there must be some kind of love-hate relationship that you have with your faith, with your ancestry, with your country, because I think all of us have been through that experience. Would you please tell us a little about it?
What is your name?
Milia.
Milia. Milia, like, it's to put it down to anything, it's survival. And I have that feeling, that need to go on and to not let something like corrosive or difficult, something that's going to harm you, like lay you low. That's very strong in me. Like so there's probably a level of emotion that I can't let in because I must carry on. I must not let the bad father, the bad country, I mustn't let these things kind of like, because this experience of exile, it's very romantic in one way because we know the exiles who succeeded, but there's a lovely line in Hisham Attar's book, Friends, where he says, with the Arab writers, that London was a place where Arab writers came to die, and they stayed in exile, and they didn't work, and they didn't produce masterpieces of art and literature. Their creativity didn't blossom. They were just homesick. So, like, I think that probably I have that mechanism where I can't let this stuff, it's not that I don't recognize it, but there's no way to let it in the way that you're talking about without it somehow undermining you. And that I don't want to be like extinguished by these things that I didn't choose any of it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
My name is Robin Broadfield.
Don't tell me you were in school with my father.
And that was the next thing I was going to say, that I did not know your father. No. Sorry about that. But, I'm wondering if the somewhat parallel situation that we're in now in the last 6 months in the US and some of the experiences you've been through might stimulate you to write about the USA today. Has it at all? Might it at all?
So there's been this small essay which I wrote, which came out in May, and it's I would direct you to that essay. It's a good essay. I'm proud of it, but it's I think it's just a beginning, and it's I'll tell you the way we grew up. Because of the shape of power and because of the way things were configured, a lot of my elder writers, people I admired, Amitav Ghosh, V.S. Naipaul, they would always say to me, these are societies that are very written about. They don't need you to write about them. You must go and write about what you know and your places. And that felt very right to me then. But it doesn't feel right to me now. Like it feels like maybe they didn't know the degree to which like a kind of the shape of the world that they had been familiar with would be destabilized. And I think that in that destabilization, I certainly feel the urgency and the need to do that writing. And so probably I am engaged in it.
Yeah, I think you can see in this book is sort of an exercise in finding your feet.
Right.
In that moment of instability. I think, we're less than a decade away from when former British Prime Minister Theresa May pronounced that anybody who sees himself as a citizen of the world is a citizen of nowhere.
Right.
A proclamation that, is very annoying in many ways, but also really shook me as somebody who definitely saw himself as a citizen of the world, and I'm sure you do too in many ways.
Yeah.
And we're also a few months removed, or not even a few weeks removed from the most powerful, or maybe the second most powerful man in India, Amit Shah, saying that anybody who speaks English in India should feel ashamed or will
Yeah.
feel ashamed too.
Yeah.
In
So
becoming-
that's yeah.
and I feel like, sorry, these are two things that to me
Yeah.
bookend a little bit of what's in play right now.
Yeah, look, two different. In the first instance, that's such a callous thing to say, because is the person who was sent by the empire to Trinidad to work in the fields, was he an extravagant stranger, a sort of wild cosmopolitan? You know, like the implication of privilege. Today, you see plane loads of people go from our countries to the Gulf. They will have the experience of seeing their society from the outside. They will be people who balance different societies in their head. They will have had cosmopolitanism foisted on them. Are we to say that is some... So it's the train has many carriages, but to say that, you know, that to sort of impugn cosmopolitanism in that way is just really, really like it's such a heartless thing to say about people who were not actors in history and who were acted upon. In the second instance, well, what do we say? I don't know. It is a ruling class. The people who speak English in India are generally of a privileged background. I don't know. Did they invite the English in? Did they sort of like, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I don't know what you're to do with that. Certainly Amit Shah's quest to, you know, cleanse. I mean, he wouldn't be called Amit Shah anymore if he like got rid of everything. You get rid of English, then you get rid of everything Persian. Well, Shah is an old Persian word for king. What's he going to be? Amit Raja? You know? I mean, it's just, it's and also, is it what they want? Like, what is it? Like, are they being honest about what's really driving that? Is there this state of perfect, pure Hindu identity, and then somebody kind of looks around, and you're like, well, we're done now. It's here. We have it. Enjoy. You know, like, it can't be that. It's got to be something that's just like it's got to be the face of an impulse that like is not going to be satisfied by the kind of satisfaction that they're seeking.
Right. I guess the concluding snippet that I didn't present to you was the reaction to the next mayor of New York City eating biryani with his hands. Yeah. But listen, this is a meandering conversation that we could keep on having. I urge you to buy Aatish's book. He'll be signing them up here. It's a terrific, immersive read. It takes you to lots of different places and really steeps you in a sense of history and belonging and past that is universal, that is profoundly cosmopolitan, and a terrific read. And so thank you, Aatish, for chatting with me, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you for coming out.